On a crisp autumn afternoon, in the bustling streets of South Chicago, a young black teenager was making his way home from basketball practice. His worn-out sneakers dragged slightly on the concrete as he walked, his mind filled with thoughts about the math test he'd have to study for later that night. The basketball tucked under his arm was his prized possession, a gift from his grandfather before he passed away last year. The convenience store at the corner of Oak and Main was a familiar sight. He'd pass by it every day, sometimes stopping for a cold drink when he had spare change. Today was different, though. The air felt thick with tension as he approached, and something in his gut told him to stay alert. That's when he heard it, raised voices coming from the parking lot. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what was happening. A female police officer, clearly pregnant with a visible baby bump, was trying to handle what looked like a shoplifting situation. She had one hand on her radio and another raised in a calming gesture, trying to talk down a man who was becoming increasingly agitated. The boy could see the sweat on the officer's forehead, the way she was trying to maintain her professional composure while protecting her unborn child. Her vest stretched tight across her belly, and despite her training, he could tell she was in a vulnerable position. The suspect, a tall man in a dirty jacket, was getting more aggressive by the second, his movements becoming more erratic and unpredictable. Time seemed to slow down as the boy watched the scene unfold. He noticed how the officer's hand instinctively kept moving to protect her belly, how she was trying to maintain a safe distance while still doing her job. The suspect was shouting about not going back to jail, his voice cracking with desperation. The convenience store owner was peering anxiously through the window, phone in hand, presumably calling for backup. A few other bystanders had stopped to watch, but they kept their distance, phones raised to record the scene instead of helping. The boy felt a mix of emotions: fear, concern, and a growing sense that he needed to do something. His mother had always taught him to be careful around law enforcement, to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. Growing up as a black kid in their neighborhood, he'd learned those lessons well. But something about this situation felt different. This wasn't about uniforms or badges. This was about a mother and her unborn child in danger. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he watched the officer try to reach for her handcuffs. The suspect's body language changed in an instant. His shoulders tensed, his fingers curled into fists. The boy had seen enough fights at school to know what was coming next. Without thinking about the consequences, without worrying about how it might look or what people might say, he dropped his basketball and started moving forward. The sound of approaching sirens wailed in the distance, but they were too far away. The boy knew that whatever was going to happen would be over before backup arrived. He saw the exact moment when the situation exploded. The suspect lunged forward, pushing the pregnant officer with both hands. Her eyes widened in surprise and fear as she began to lose her balance, her hands moving to protect her belly instead of breaking her fall. In that split second, the boy's basketball training kicked in. All those hours of practice, all those drills about quick movements and anticipation, were about to pay off in a way he never expected. He was already running, his feet moving faster than they ever had on the court. His mind was clear, focused on a single goal. He had to reach her before she hit the ground. His mother's warnings, the neighborhood's unspoken rules about staying away from police business, his own past experiences with racial profiling. None of that mattered now. All he saw was someone who needed help, someone's mother, someone's child. As he rushed forward, he had no idea that this moment would change not just his life, but the lives of his entire family forever. Time seemed to freeze as the boy's arms reached out to catch the falling officer. His muscles tensed as he braced himself, remembering how his basketball coach had taught him to plant his feet firmly when taking a charge on the court. The officer wasn't heavy, but the momentum of her fall made it challenging to keep them both upright. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, but his hands remained steady. As he helped stabilize the officer, he could feel her whole body trembling. The fear in her eyes quickly turned to relief, then gratitude, as she realized both she and her unborn baby were safe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly as she regained her footing. The suspect had already disappeared down the alley behind the convenience store, his footsteps fading into the distance. But neither the boy nor the officer seemed to care about that right now. The boy could see the officer's hand resting protectively on her belly, and he noticed how she took several deep breaths to calm herself. "Are you okay? Is the baby okay?" the boy asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. He suddenly felt very aware of his own hands, still supporting the officer's elbow. He started to pull away, years of ingrained caution around law enforcement kicking in, but the officer gently caught his wrist. "Don't go," she said softly. "You just saved 2 lives. I need to know who you are." Her eyes were kind, filled with tears that hadn't fallen yet. The boy could see she was still processing what had just happened, one hand still pressed against her belly, as if reassuring herself that everything was all right. More police cars were pulling into the parking lot now, their sirens cutting through the afternoon air. The boy felt his anxiety rising as other officers jumped out of their vehicles, hands on their weapons, scanning the scene. He knew how this might look, a black teenager with his hands on a police officer. But before anyone could jump to wrong conclusions, the pregnant officer raised her hand. "He's a hero," she called out to her approaching colleagues, her voice strong and clear despite her obvious shock. "This young man just saved me and my baby." The other officers immediately relaxed their postures, and the boy felt some of his tension ease away. The store owner had come outside now, still clutching his phone. "I got it all on camera," he announced, waving his cell phone. The whole thing. The boy moved so fast, like a guardian angel or something. A small crowd had gathered, and the boy could hear their murmurs of approval and amazement. One of the older officers approached them, his face serious but kind. "Son, what you did today, that took real courage. Not many people would step up like that." The boy shuffled his feet, uncomfortable with the attention but warming to the genuine appreciation in the officer's voice. The pregnant officer was being checked by paramedics who had just arrived, but she wouldn't let go of the boy's hand. "I want to know about you," she said. "About your family. Please." There was something in her voice, not just gratitude, but a deeper interest, a genuine desire to know more about the young man who had risked himself to help her. The boy thought about his family then, about his hard-working mother who held down 2 jobs, about his younger siblings who looked up to him, about their struggles that nobody in this parking lot knew about. He thought about how his mother always told him that character reveals itself in moments of crisis, and how proud she would be of his actions today. As he stood there, surrounded by police officers who were looking at him with respect instead of suspicion for the first time in his life, the boy had no way of knowing that this moment would lead to changes he couldn't even imagine. His simple act of courage was about to set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone he loved. The walk home that evening felt different for the boy. Streetlights were just starting to flicker on, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. His basketball, retrieved from where he dropped it, felt heavier than usual under his arm. His mind kept replaying the events at the convenience store, the grateful eyes of the pregnant officer, the respectful nods from her colleagues. He climbed the creaky stairs to their 3rd-floor apartment, passing by the peeling paint and water stains that his mother always apologized for when anyone visited. The smell of his mom's cooking, beans and rice tonight, he could tell, drifted through the thin walls. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since lunch. Inside, his little brother was sprawled on their worn couch, homework spread around him. His sisters sat at their small kitchen table, helping their mother chop vegetables. None of them knew what had happened yet. None of them knew that he'd just done something that would change everything. "You're late," his mother called from the kitchen, but there was no anger in her voice, just the usual worry that came with raising a black teenager in their neighborhood. She wiped her hands on her apron, the one she'd had since he could remember, faded but clean. Her eyes searched his face, the way they always did, checking for any signs of trouble. Something happened at the store, he started, his voice quieter than usual. His mother's face immediately tensed. Those words usually meant bad news in their neighborhood. His siblings looked up, homework forgotten. But as he began telling the story, his mother's expression changed from worry to disbelief, then to a pride so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. A pregnant police officer. His sister gasped, the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables forgotten on the cutting board. And you caught her. His little brother had abandoned his homework completely, mouth open in amazement. His mother sat down heavily in one of their mismatched kitchen chairs. "My boy," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "My brave, brave boy." He could see the mix of emotions on her face, pride warring with the fear that came from years of teaching her children to be careful around law enforcement. But there was something else bothering him, something he hadn't told anyone yet. While the paramedics were checking the officer, he'd overheard her asking questions about him, about his family. He'd heard her voice soften when someone mentioned they lived in the struggling part of town. He wasn't sure what to make of that. His mother must have sensed his unease. "What is it?" she asked, still holding his hand. "There's something else, isn't there?" She knew him too well, could always tell when something was weighing on his mind. He hesitated, thinking about the eviction notice hidden in his mother's dresser drawer, the one he'd found while putting away laundry last week. He knew she didn't want them to worry, but he'd seen her crying late at night when she thought they were asleep. He'd heard her on the phone, begging for more time to pay the rent. Just then, there was a knock at their door, firm but polite. His mother froze, her hand tightening on his. They weren't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors rarely brought good news to their neighborhood. His sister quickly turned off the stove, a habit born from years of hiding their presence when bill collectors came calling. But when his mother opened the door, it wasn't a bill collector or the landlord. There stood the pregnant officer from the store, still in her uniform but without her vest, alongside another officer. In her hands, she held a folder that would turn out to contain something none of them could have expected. The boy watched his mother's face, saw her instinctive tension, the way she subtly tried to position herself between the officers and her children. But then the pregnant officer smiled, warm and genuine, and spoke words that would mark the beginning of their family's transformation. Standing in their small living room, the pregnant officer seemed to take in everything at once. The carefully mended curtains, the stack of job applications on the coffee table, the worn but spotlessly clean carpet. Her eyes were kind as she asked if they could all sit down to talk. The boy's mother, still cautious but warming to the officer's gentle demeanor, cleared space on their old couch. First, the pregnant officer began, resting one hand on her belly. "I needed to thank you properly." She looked at the boy's mother. "Your son did something extraordinary today. But as I was getting checked out at the hospital, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he mentioned having to get home to help with dinner and homework." The boy watched his mother's hands fidget with her apron strings, a nervous habit he'd known all his life. The stack of past due bills hidden in the kitchen drawer seemed to weigh heavily in the room. His little brother and sister sat cross-legged on the floor, unusually quiet, watching the scene unfold. "We did some checking," the second officer added, his voice softer than expected. "And we found something interesting." He looked directly at the boy's mother. "You've applied for a position at the police department 3 times in the past year. Administrative work in the records division." The boy saw his mother's back stiffen. It was true. She'd been trying to find better work, something with benefits, something that would let her quit her second job cleaning offices at night. But her applications had disappeared into silence, like so many others. Those applications, the pregnant officer continued, opening the folder she'd brought, they got lost in the system. Misplaced during a computer upgrade. She pulled out some papers, and the boy could see his mother's neat handwriting on them. "But what I saw today, what your son did, It made me curious about these applications, so I looked deeper. The boy's mother sat straighter, her dignity evident even in their humble surroundings. "I'm qualified for that position," she said quietly but firmly. "I have experience. I can do the work." "Yes," the pregnant officer smiled, "you are. More than qualified, actually. Your references are excellent. Your previous employer spoke very highly of your organizational skills and work ethic." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The position is still open, and I'd like to make sure your application gets proper consideration this time." The boy felt his heart skip a beat. His sister gasped softly. Their mother's hands stopped fidgeting with her apron, frozen in mid-movement. "But there's more," the pregnant officer continued. She pulled out another set of papers. "While looking into this, we learned about your housing situation." The boy saw his mother's face fall, shame and pride battling in her expression. "And we want to help with that too." The second officer spoke up again. "There's a community housing program for city employees. Better apartments, reasonable rent, safe neighborhood. If you're interested, and if you get the position, you qualify immediately." The boy watched tears well up in his mother's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. He knew her pride, knew how hard it was for her to accept help. But he also knew their reality, the endless struggle, the constant fear of eviction, the nights she went hungry so they could eat. "Why?" his mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do all this?" The pregnant officer reached across and took his mother's hand. "Because today, your son didn't see a uniform. He didn't see color. He saw a person in trouble and acted without hesitation. He showed us what community really means, and maybe it's time we showed the same in return." In that moment, sitting in their small apartment with the sound of traffic floating up from the street below, the boy understood that his simple act of kindness had opened a door none of them had even known existed. But as his mother's shoulders began to shake with silent tears of relief, he also realized this was just the beginning of their story. 2 weeks later, the boy sat on a hard plastic chair outside the police department's human resources office, his clean but well-worn dress shirt feeling slightly tight around the collar. His mother sat beside him, wearing her best outfit, the one she usually saved for church. Her interview was scheduled to start in 10 minutes. Through the glass walls, he could see office workers moving about, carrying files and coffee cups. Some smiled as they passed, recognizing him from the story that had spread through the department. The pregnant officer had kept her word. His mother's application had been found, reviewed, and now here they were. "You don't have to wait with me," his mother whispered, her hands smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her skirt. But they both knew he wasn't going anywhere. He'd been there through everything. The late nights when she practiced interview questions, the hours spent updating her resume at the public library, the careful selection of her outfit from their limited wardrobe. Down the hall, he spotted the pregnant officer walking towards them, her belly now even more pronounced. She moved more slowly these days, but still had that same warm smile. She'd become a regular visitor to their apartment, helping his mother prepare for the interview, bringing over forms for the housing program, even tutoring his sister in math when she learned the girl was struggling. "I brought you both something," the officer said, holding out 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the cafeteria. The boy noticed how his mother's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup. "You've got this," the officer added softly, squeezing his mother's shoulder. Just then, a door opened, and a woman with kind eyes called his mother's name. The boy watched his mother stand, straightening her shoulders the way she always did when facing a challenge. Before walking in, she turned to him, and in her eyes, he saw all the years of struggle, all the hopes she held for their family. As the door closed behind her, the pregnant officer sat in the now empty chair. "Your mom's been practicing hard for this," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. The boy nodded, thinking about how his mother had stayed up late every night, rehearsing answers while doing the laundry or preparing their lunches for the next day. "You know, The officer continued, her voice thoughtful. When you caught me that day, you didn't just save me and my baby. You reminded everyone in the department about why we do this job. To help people, to build bridges, to make our community better. She paused, rubbing her belly absently. Your mother's application isn't getting special treatment. She's getting the fair chance she should have had from the start. The boy thought about the changes of the past 2 weeks. News of his actions had spread through their neighborhood. People who'd never spoken to them before stopped to chat. His basketball coach had tears in his eyes when he heard the story. Even their landlord, who'd been threatening eviction, had become more patient about the late rent. Through the glass, he could see his mother sitting straight in her chair, speaking with confidence. He recognized that look. It was the same one she wore when standing up to bill collectors or helping neighbors in need. It was the look of someone who'd been knocked down many times, but always got back up. 45 minutes later, when his mother emerged from the office, her eyes were shining. The interviewer followed her out, shaking her hand with genuine warmth. The boy didn't need words to understand what had happened. He could see it in his mother's smile, in the way she held herself just a little taller. The pregnant officer stood up, wrapping his mother in a hug that crossed all the invisible lines that usually divided their worlds. In that moment, watching these two strong women embrace, the boy understood that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. But there was still more to come, more ways in which his simple act of courage would ripple out to touch not just his family, but their entire community. The next chapter of their story was about to unfold in ways none of them could have imagined. 1 month later, the boy stood in an empty apartment, sunlight streaming through clean windows much bigger than the ones in their old place. The walls were freshly painted, the floors newly polished. His footsteps echoed in the empty space as he walked from room to room, still hardly believing this would be their new home. His mother had gotten the job at the police department. Better pay, regular hours, health insurance. Things that had seemed like impossible dreams just weeks ago. The community housing program the pregnant officer had mentioned turned out to be perfect for them. A safe building, close to good schools, and rent they could actually afford. But that wasn't all that had changed. Word of his story had spread beyond the police department, reaching local news stations. At first, his mother had been hesitant about the attention, worried about how it might affect their lives. But then something unexpected happened. Their story started bringing people together. Standing in what would be his new bedroom, his own room for the first time in his life, he heard voices in the hallway. Opening the door, he found neighbors he hadn't met yet, carrying boxes and furniture. Some wore police uniforms, others were in regular clothes, but all had come to help his family move in. The pregnant officer, now in her final month, supervised from a comfortable chair in the living room, directing traffic and making sure everyone took water breaks. Her husband was there too, helping to assemble furniture they'd donated from their own home. The boy watched as people who might never have spoken to each other worked side by side, sharing stories and laughs. His little sister was already making friends with kids from the building, showing them her books and toys as they helped unpack her things. His brother, usually shy around strangers, was eagerly helping to set up the donated computer that would help with his schoolwork. Their mother moved through it all with happy tears in her eyes, thanking everyone, still amazed by this outpouring of community support. The local grocery store owner arrived with boxes of food to stock their new kitchen. The basketball coach brought a new hoop, promising to install it in the building's courtyard so all the kids could play. Even his old landlord showed up, not to collect rent, but to congratulate them and bring some houseplants as a moving gift. A reporter from the local news station was there too, but she wasn't just covering the story, she was helping carry boxes. She told the boy how his actions had inspired a new community outreach program between the police department and local schools. Officers would visit regularly, not for enforcement, but to build relationships, to coach sports teams, to help with homework. As the afternoon went on, more people kept arriving. Someone ordered pizzas for everyone. The empty apartment slowly filled with furniture, with food, with laughter. The boy watched as his mother spoke with her new coworkers, her confidence growing with each conversation. She was no longer just the struggling single mom from the poor side of town. She was a respected member of the community. The pregnant officer called him over to sit beside her. "Look around," she said softly, gesturing at the scene before them. "This is what community really means. One small act of kindness can start a chain reaction that brings out the best in everyone." She smiled, rubbing her belly. "And it all started because you didn't hesitate to help a stranger." Through the windows, you could see the sun starting to set, casting a warm glow over their new neighborhood. Children played in the courtyard below, their laughter floating up to mix with the conversations and music in the apartment. This wasn't just a new home they were moving into. It was a new chapter in their lives, a fresh start built on the foundation of unexpected friendship and community support. But even as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of their new beginning, the boy had no idea that the biggest surprise was still to come. A surprise that would prove just how far the ripples of one brave action could reach. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day at the convenience store. The boy stood in front of a crowded community center, his heart beating fast but steady. The room was filled with familiar faces, police officers, neighbors, local business owners, and students from his school. At the center of it all sat the pregnant officer, no longer pregnant, but holding her healthy baby girl, now 3 months old. Today wasn't just any community gathering. The police department had organized this event to launch a new youth mentorship program, inspired by what had happened that day. But there was something else too, something the boy hadn't expected when he agreed to come. His mother sat in the front row, wearing her police department staff badge with pride. Her eyes shone as she watched him. Next to her sat his siblings, both doing better than ever in their new school. His sister had started a tutoring program for younger kids in the building. His brother had overcome his shyness and joined the computer club. The police chief stepped up to the microphone, his voice warm as he told their story. Not just about the day of the rescue, but about what had happened since. How one act of courage had sparked a change in the whole community. He talked about the walls that had come down, the friendships that had formed, the trust that had been built. Today, the chief announced, we're not just launching a mentorship program. We're also introducing a new scholarship fund. He paused, looking directly at the boy. A fund named after the young man who showed us what real community policing looks like. A fund that will help other young people in our neighborhood pursue their dreams of higher education. The boy felt his breath catch. He hadn't known about this part. His mother was crying now, happy tears streaming down her face. The officer with the baby stood up, walking to the podium with her daughter in her arms. "This baby," she said, her voice full of emotion, "will grow up in a different world because of what happened that day. Not just because this young man saved us, but because he showed us all what's possible when we look past our differences and just see each other as people." She told the crowd how the boy still visited them regularly, how her daughter's face lit up whenever he came over, how his simple act of courage had inspired other officers to volunteer in the community, had encouraged local businesses to create job programs for teens, had brought people together who might never have spoken before. The boy looked out at the crowd as they applauded. He saw the convenience store owner, who'd caught everything on camera that day, now running a job training program for local youth. He saw his basketball coach, who'd started bringing police officers to help with practice, building bridges through sports. He saw his new neighbors, who'd become like extended family. When it was his turn to speak, he kept it simple and from the heart. He talked about his mother's strength, about the community that had embraced them, about the baby girl who reminded him every day that one small choice could change so many lives. As he finished speaking, his mother hugged him tight, whispering how proud she was. The officer handed him her baby daughter to hold, and the little girl grabbed his finger with her tiny hand, smiling up at him with complete trust. Looking around the room, at all the faces that had become part of their story, the boy finally understood the full impact of what had happened that day. It wasn't just about saving someone's life. It wasn't even about the opportunities it had created for his family. It was about showing people that change was possible, that barriers could be broken, that community meant something real and powerful. And as he stood there, holding this precious baby girl who might never have been born if he'd walked past that store without stopping, he knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would continue to grow and touch lives for years to come.